Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Tuesday, November 15th, 2022. Podcasting, audiobooks, and the third thing. Red Circle makes host-read advertising simple and scalable with our full-service platform. Book ads across hundreds of independent podcasts in just minutes. Click the link in the show notes to get started now. Also this week on the Sounds Profitable Deep Dive, Brian Barletta is joined by Veritonic Client Success Engineer Chase Bernhardt to tour the Veritonic Attribution Platform. Tune in to see how Veritonic Attribution allows clients to measure success, improve upon, and find the best fits for their campaigns. All right, and just a quick editorial note on this week. Portions of this newsletter were originally published in my previous newsletter, I Hear Things, but I've updated some stats and some other things to take into account some recent developments. So I hope you enjoy this. Earlier this year, the Audio Publishers Association released the results of their annual consumer survey, something I've been privileged to work on for the last decade or so. Among the key findings were these spicy meatballs. The percentage of Americans 18 plus who have ever listened to an audiobook is now 45%. That's up from 44% in 2020. Membership in audiobook services increased, with 41% of listeners indicating they subscribe to at least one such service. The overall share of time spent listening to audio, share of ear for audiobooks, has grown 106% since 2017. Daily audiobook listeners spend more time listening to books than any other form of audio, including podcasts. The daily reach of audiobook consumption has grown 94% since 2017. And daily audiobook listeners spend more than 2 hours a day listening to audio content than the general population does, about 6.5 hours versus around 4 hours for the general pop. While the current renaissance of talk and personality-driven audio is largely being driven by podcasting, audiobooks are not just a passenger on this ride. They, too, are an important driver of the total time spent listening to audio. And in fact, as I just mentioned, audiobook consumers are among the very best consumers of audio, period. The continued innovation and increasing quality is driving the consumption of both podcasts and audiobooks to such an extent that Americans' overall audio consumption has shifted from 20% talk, 80% music back in 2014 to 29% talk, 71% music today. And the stickiness of audiobooks and the time and attention they command is certainly a driver behind Spotify's interest in the space, although they had a bit of a dust-up with Apple on this topic a couple of weeks ago. You can click on the link to that in the show notes. Now, that shift in talk listening over music listening, that's not a stat to take lightly. Most Americans mostly listen to mostly music. Say that 3 times fast. And such grand shifts in behavior aren't all that common. With the amount of time we spend listening to audio relatively unchanged over that period of time, it's been about 4 hours a day. That means it isn't just that spoken word audio has grown as audio has grown. It's actually more of a zero-sum game than that. But what we've clearly seen over the last 5 years is a mix of content innovation and business model innovation that's led to both audiobooks and podcasting growing in reach and frequency of listening. There are plenty of people who do one or the other, of course, but there are enough who listen to both to make some interesting observations about their intersection. For many of these people, podcasts are where they turn to learn something new, while audiobooks are what they listen to for relaxation. But does it need to be that way? Is there something endemic to the format of either that dictates these perceptions? I don't think so. And instead, I think the two mediums will continue to cross-pollinate each other and maybe even create a third thing. When I was an undergrad at Tufts years ago, I took a course called The Literature of Chaos, which was an exploration of existential literature, Camus, Sartre, Beavis, Butthead, the classics. I can't say that many of those authors stayed with me over the years, except for one, Jorge Luis Borges. Now, I was a sophomore, I think, with a heavy class load when I took this course, so I probably initially gravitated to Borges because his ficciones, his works of fiction, were short. Borges wrote what I suppose you would call short stories, but in reality, they were kind of their own dog. They were a literary vehicle entirely of his creation. The stories of Borges were not exactly between a short story and a novel. They kind of hovered over them, a third thing. The style he developed is a great example of the power of constraints, I think. As a child in Argentina, he became extraordinarily well-read in both Spanish and English, and by the time he was a young man, he had complete command of the masterworks of both literature and philosophy. He also had horrible eyesight. By the time he hit 30, his myopia and cataracts had become so bad that he was having terrible accidents. After a couple of good whacks to the head from bad falls, he suffered a detached retina in his remaining good eye, and that was it. Borges was blind. His entire career was based on reading and writing literature, and in the middle of his life, he lost the ability to do either in the same way again. He never learned to read Braille. Instead, he relied on his mother and some hired help to read to him and transcribe his dictated words. And this new constraint contributed to something truly marvelous. Imagine that everything you knew about literature came from reading Shakespeare or Tolstoy, but then in the middle of your career, you had to switch from reading War and Peace to having War and Peace read to you. Let me tell you, I love audiobooks, and I've worked with the Audio Publishers Association, Audible, and some others in the space for years. There is no freaking way I am listening to 61 hours of War and Peace. Now imagine trying to conceive and write War and Peace without ever putting pen to paper or having a keyboard. If Tolstoy had written War and Peace under the same conditions that Borges wrote Ficciones, I highly doubt it would have been 590,000 words long. Instead of writing the kinds of long novels he had studied as a younger man, he simply imagined that they had already existed and wrote short pieces about encountering these imaginary works as if they had in fact been written. Not quite short story, and certainly not the cliff notes of a book, but an entirely different experience altogether. Borges himself described the process like this. The composition of vast books is a laborious and impoverishing extravagance. A better course of procedure is to pretend that these books already exist and then to offer a resume, a commentary. More reasonable, more inept, more indolent, I have preferred to write notes upon imaginary books. My favorite of these short works was a story called Tlan Uqbar Orbis Tertius, which told the story of the lost country of Uqbar and the fantastical stories of the world of Tlan that made up Uqbar's mythology. Tolkien would have turned the stories of Tlan into a trilogy of novels and probably 6 movies, but as dictated by Borges, it was just 5,600 words long, or about twice the length of my average newsletter, which doesn't say much for my editing prowess. All right, that was a bit of a diversion. I bring Borges up because I'm fascinated by the third thing, as I'm calling it here. I get to work with both podcasting companies and audiobook publishers, and it's my job to help each of them understand their audiences. The streams of both industries have been crossing for some time now. I mean, what was S-Town but an audiobook that was brought to you by Blue Apron instead of purchased with a credit on Audible? And just as Tlan Uqbar Orbis Tertius was not the story of Uqbar, but the story of Borges excavating the story of Uqbar, so too was S-Town the story of its author, Brian Reed, encountering the story of S-Town. You get a similar sense from Odyssey/Pineapple Street's podcast, Stay Away from Matthew McGill, which starts out as the story of Matthew McGill, but is really the story of Eric Mennel, the journalist excavating McGill's life. We think we know what a podcast is, and we think we know what an audiobook is. But are we sure? I've done a lot of qualitative interviews with people who are either new to podcasting or have only heard of it but not sampled the wares. You know what they tell me a podcast is? That's right, an audio enclosure in an RSS feed. No, I'm just kidding. No, to many, a podcast is simply someone sharing their opinion about something. That's the form to which they have been exposed in some way, and that's informed their received wisdom about the medium. A podcast is just some person with a mic and an opinion. I suppose S-Town and Matthew McGill are, at their heart, some dude with a mic and an opinion and a Winnebago full of production staff. But I'm sure we can all agree that podcasting continues to push these boundaries. Podcast producers are learning from all sorts of sources: the audiobook industry, the radio industry, even TV, and the medium is continuing to evolve. The audiobook industry, too, is learning from podcasting. We're starting to see more original straight-to-audio works. More short audiobooks, under 3 hours or so, are being made available and becoming popular. Audible's production of West Cork sits right at the intersection of everything that the marriage of an audiobook and a podcast could be: the audio design, production, and storytelling container of a podcast, but the structure and the narrative arc of a great novel. Is it a podcast, an audiobook? Your answer might change depending on where you listen to it or how it's monetized. I think there's still great innovation possible in the audiobook space, potentially disruptive innovation. Audiobooks continue to largely be the narration of art that was meant to be read and not heard. We buy audiobooks because we enjoy the convenience of being able to enjoy a book while we're driving or doing chores, because we enjoy the prowess of a great narrator, or even so that we can finish a book more quickly by squeezing it into parts of our day where we couldn't exactly read. But a book in its native form was written for the eye and not the ear. Shortly after I finish this podcast, I will stumble across dozens of things that I wrote, but I wouldn't say, and I will change them or I won't in the moment, which is not a luxury most audiobook narrators have. So yeah, go ahead and edit Sue Grafton on the fly there, Mr. N is for narrator. That's why I think the fact that Malcolm Gladwell has turned into a pretty good podcaster is potentially such an important thing for the audiobook industry. The audio version of The Bomber Mafia, for instance, or his recent Paul Simon book, they're not simply books with additional audio interviews. It was written to be spoken, and I hope more writers follow suit and really rethink the audiobook as more than just a narration of their written word. Most writers don't think or write like podcasters. What's scanned so well on the page can suddenly feel stilted or turgid when read out loud, and just writing stilted or turgid feels stilted and turgid. You can see why Borges just skipped to the good parts in his stories. Traditional exposition just doesn't work orally any more than it does in TV or the movies. But it's nonfiction that I think could spark the most innovation. Now, personally, I'm not a consumer of business audiobooks, for example. My learning preference is text. I am someone who juggles a few books at once, and if I'm reading a business book that I have to put down for a while, I can easily pick back up where I left off because I can scan back a little to pick up the context before plowing into a new chapter. With an audiobook, you can't do that. You just pick up mid-sentence sometimes and have to immediately contextualize what you're hearing now with what you can recall from prior listening sessions. But think about what a podcast does with that same content. It's broken up into chapter-like episodes, yeah, but each episode has an intro that catches you up and an outro that teases what is to come. Sometimes there are even mid-episode breaks brought to you by BetterHelp with more helpful staging and contextualizing. Even if it's been a month between episodes, these mechanics enable the listener to pick up with any episode in the middle of a narrative arc and very quickly get back into the flow. So why couldn't audiobooks do the same thing? As far as what podcasting can learn from audiobooks, well, plenty. Let's start here. People pay for audiobooks. In a world in which consumers get all-you-can-eat movies on Netflix and all-you-can-eat music on Pandora and Spotify, audiobooks have retained their value for publishers and authors. While we can check out audiobooks out of public libraries, the latest John Grisham audiobook commands the same list price as the hardcover book, or at least one of a finite number of credits from a monthly subscription service like Audible. In a world where streaming music artists make pennies a song, and podcast industry experts question whether or not any kind of subscription model could work, audiobooks keep chugging along, selling individual titles, providing value to listeners and creators alike. So let's wrap up and come back to the third thing, the thing that is crafted with all of the creative force of the novelist or biographer, but designed from the ground up to be heard, not just through sound design, but packaged for easy episodic consumption and written to be heard and not read. The thing that we can easily listen to like a podcast, but that we pay directly for like a movie rental. It might be windowed or even priced differently over time like movies are. It resists the lean forward bias of the podcast or the lean back perception of the audiobook. The third thing is not the audio version of a book, nor is it the transcription of a podcast. It is the atomic unit of the core idea or story. My wife Tamsin would call it the red thread, produced from scratch in one way for the eye and in another completely different way for the ear. For example, while I'm a heavy consumer of audiobooks, never in a million years would I listen to an audiobook version of my behavioral economics hero Daniel Kahneman read Thinking Fast and Slow. That's just not how I personally am going to process that book. But surely a ground-up reimagining of that work for audio consumption could be created that sounds like a podcast, but conveys the full force of Kahneman's red thread in a format more conducive to the oral tradition than simply reading the book aloud. I hope you get the idea. This is more than listener-driven innovation. It's idea-driven innovation, the real work of building the third thing. I'm Tom Webster. Thanks again for listening to this article, Podcasting, Audiobooks, and the Third Thing. This episode was built using Spooler and hosted on Omny Studio by Trident Digital. We'll see you next time.